Most of you, I'm sure, have heard the story of Esther. It's a story that's real common in Sunday school lessons, and it really is a good story, just in terms of literature. It makes a wonderful story, and it's the basis for the Jewish holiday of Purim that they celebrate every year. So culturally, it's probably at least kind of important that we understand it. But you don't hear it preached from very often. You don't hear a whole lot of people talk about it other than just tell the story. And in fact, it's the only book of the Bible that doesn't even mention God. Not once. He's alluded to, but he's not named. He's not prayed to, not called out, unless you want to look at the non-scriptural edition that includes Mordecai's prayer, but we're not even going to talk about that. But the canonical book of Esther doesn't even contain a reference to God. In fact, there was a time when people argued whether it should be included as scripture because it doesn't talk about God. It was eventually included, of course, and I believe it is scripture. But what are we supposed to get out of this? What's the lesson of Esther? Other than, there's the clear, broad lesson. God took care of his people. He preserved them. He didn't let them get destroyed, right? But the center, in terms of literature, of the story of Esther is Esther coming to the king on behalf of her people. And I think that there's a lesson other than her sacrifice to be drawn out of this. I believe there's a lesson that the New Testament teaches using this story that is just an illusion that we normally miss. And I didn't see it until just the other day, and all of a sudden it hit me like a ton of bricks. So I want to share it with you. So real quick, most of you probably have heard the story. If you don't remember it, I highly recommend you go read it. It's not a very long book, it's not 10 chapters or so, but it's a good story. Just sit down and read it. Anyway, so the queen, Vashti, was told to do something. It was something not exactly moral or ethical, but she disobeyed. It would have been against her honor, and she disobeyed. And the king said, "Well, you can't be queen because you disobeyed me." And so he divorced her. And now he's looking for a new queen. And so they went on this talent search for a new queen. Long story short, he picks Esther. Well, she's Jewish, and he doesn't know this, and that's okay. And she's got this uncle named Mordecai who raised her, who gets on the wrong side of a Persian prince. And this Persian prince decides he's going to kill all the Jews as a result. Well, Mordecai goes to Esther and says, "You got to go ask the king to put a stop to this." And she says, "I can't go to the king. I can't go into the throne room because no one is allowed to approach the king unbidden. It's a death sentence." And he says, "Well, look, you've been put there for such a time as this." Now, that's the allusion to God I mentioned. Essentially, he's saying, God put you there, now go do your job. And she says, okay. So she fasts and prays, approaches the king. He spares her life. She requests mercy for her people through a long process. He says, yeah, that's pretty screwed up. Realizes this Persian prince is after his queen and destroys him, and everyone lives happily ever after. Okay, so there's the outline of the story. Now, let's talk about that center point, that high point of her going to the king on behalf of her people at risk of her own life. This is the culmination of the story, right? What's he going to do? Is it going to work? Let's read what it actually says. On the third day, this is after 3 days of fasting. On a third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. And the king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, even to the half of my kingdom." Okay, so the holding out the scepter and that whole ritual, that was the pardon. That was the, I accept you can approach rather than off with her head. All right? So, this is the culmination. It's a beautiful part of the story, but what does this teach us theologically? Why am I saying this is in the New Testament? Well, let's go to Hebrews chapter 4. Since then, we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Now, a lot of Hebrews talks about Jesus as our high priest and makes the comparison contrast between him and the Aaronic priesthood. And this is really getting into that discussion of Jesus as the high priest. So what does Jesus being high priest have to do with the throne of grace? Well, if you remember, the high priest only went into the Holy of Holies once a year, had to do lots and lots of sacrifices, and hope he got it right because he might get struck dead. And he wore bells and pomegranates around the base of his robe, so that and had a rope tied to his foot, so that if they stopped hearing the bells shaking, they knew God struck him dead and they'd drag him out. I mean, it was that serious to go into God's presence. You could die if you didn't do it right, and only once a year when you were told you could, and only that person, and that's it. And that the blood that the high priest took in is sprinkled on the mercy seat on the top of the Ark of the Covenant. That's God's throne in the Holy of Holies, if you want to call it that. So he's saying in Hebrews, Jesus is a different kind of high priest. He gets our weaknesses. He understands our problems. And so he's sympathetic with us, and he intercedes for us. And he's without sin. So we know he's not getting struck dead because he has nothing wrong for God to judge, right? And so therefore, because of God's love shown through Jesus Christ and the sacrifice that he made, his perfect sacrifice without sin, for us, not for him, now we can approach the Holy of Holies. We saw in Esther that Esther approached the throne and found favor with the king. The word grace means favor. It's the Greek root charis. It's every dictionary you go to is going to say favor, comma, grace as the definition of the Greek word. It's the same thing. Esther found grace. Rather than being killed for coming into his presence unbidden, she boldly walked into that throne room and said, I need help. And he said, you have my favor, Esther. What do you need? Let me help. And she got what she needed. I think that's what the writer of Hebrews is saying here. We don't have to once a year hope the high priest does a good enough job. We've got a high priest that did a perfect job. And so we can go in, and rather than sprinkling blood on a mercy seat, we can go in knowing God is full of mercy and loves us so much, his bride, his queen, that he wants us to come into his presence, and he wants to give us his favor.